The soft hum of airplane engines filled the air as Snoop Dogg settled into his plush first-class seat. After weeks of back-to-back performances, this flight was supposed to be a rare luxury, a moment of peace earned through years of relentless hustle. Outside his window, the evening sky burned with streaks of orange and pink. He adjusted his shades, the faint clink of his leather briefcase opening as he pulled out notes for an upcoming concert tour. But then, a voice, sharp, dismissive, and getting closer. "Can you believe this seating mix-up?" a woman muttered, her tone dripping with irritation. Snoop's eyes flicked up. A tall, blonde woman stood in the aisle, her designer handbag swinging from her elbow like a trophy. Behind her, a brunette friend offered a nervous laugh. "It has to be a mistake, Elizabeth," the friend whispered. Elizabeth's eyes locked on Snoop, her polished smile tight and cold. "Excuse me," she said curtly. Snoop glanced up calmly. "Yeah?" Her voice was clipped, every word sharp. "I believe there's been an error. This is my seat." Snoop's brow lifted behind his shades. "This is 1A," he replied smoothly. "Booked it weeks ago." Elizabeth's lips curled slightly, her tone sliding into condescension. "You see, I'm a gold tier member. I always get this seat. I'm sure you'd be more comfortable elsewhere." A flicker of amusement crossed Snoop's face. "I'm plenty comfortable right here, thanks." Her smile vanished, replaced by a thin-lipped glare. Before she could press further, a flight attendant arrived, his polished uniform adding a thin veneer of authority. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. Elizabeth's voice turned syrupy with performance. "Yes. My seat seems to have been given away. I always fly 1A. It's policy." The attendant turned to Snoop, his voice polite but carrying an undertone that Snoop knew too well. "Sir, can I see your ticket?" Without breaking his calm, Snoop handed it over. "Sure." The attendant scanned it and blinked. "This is his seat," he confirmed. "Booked and confirmed." Elizabeth's composure cracked. "That can't be right," she snapped, her voice rising. "Did he?" Her eyes narrowed. "Buy a last-minute upgrade or something?" Snoop's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed smooth. "Nah, paid for this seat long time ago." Her friend tugged her arm, whispering, "Elizabeth, maybe we should just—" But Elizabeth wasn't backing down. Her voice dropped, cold and cutting. "I don't think you understand," she hissed. "I always fly first class, and I'm not about to let someone like—" "Elizabeth!" her friend gasped, horrified. Snoop's eyes, hidden but sharp behind his shades, locked on hers. "Someone like what, exactly?" he said softly, his voice calm but charged. The air in the cabin shifted. The conversations hushed, but the tension hung thick. The attendant, clearly uneasy, stepped in. "Ma'am, if you have further concerns, you can speak with our supervisor." Elizabeth's glare burned, but with a sharp breath and a withering look at Snoop, she stormed toward the front. Snoop watched her go, his face impassive. The whispers in the cabin tickled his ears. Curiosity, judgment, and something else. Something familiar, but he didn't bite. He leaned back, took a slow sip of water, and closed his eyes behind his shades. This wasn't over, but Snoop had played this game before. The cabin buzzed with that uneasy tension, the kind where people pretend not to listen but hang on every word. Snoop flipped open his leather notebook, his fingers brushing across pages filled with handwritten notes, ideas, lyrics, moves for his upcoming tour. He didn't need to look to feel the eyes on him. But then, another commotion. The cabin door opened. A middle-aged woman in a crisp uniform entered, with the air of someone used to fixing problems. "Diane Lewis, flight supervisor, experienced, efficient, but—" "Right now?" Uneasy. Elizabeth was on her immediately. "Finally, I've been mistreated by your staff. That man is in my seat." Diane's eyes flicked to Snoop. Something— recognition, maybe? Flashed there, but her voice stayed professional. "Mr. Dogg," she said, measured. Would you be willing to switch seats? We have another first-class spot available. Snoop closed his notebook. His voice smooth but edged with steel. No. Elizabeth's eyes blazed. Seriously? You're going to be difficult over a chair? Snoop's gaze, calm and direct, met hers. It's not about the seat, it's about principle. The tension snapped tight. Elizabeth, her voice dripping venom. Oh, I see. You're making this a thing. Snoop's voice stayed easy, steady, but heavy with meaning. Nah. You made it a thing the second you thought I didn't belong here. The air in the cabin froze. Diane trying to de-escalate. Mrs. Stokes, please. But Elizabeth's mask cracked, and out spilled the venom she couldn't hold. I am a platinum elite member. I spend more on this airline than he probably makes in a... Her friend's panicked whisper. Elizabeth, but it was too late. The air thick. Snoop, his voice low but razor sharp. Careful, your privilege is showing. Its cabin. Silent. People who'd pretended not to watch, now frozen, eyes locked on the scene. Elizabeth faltered, face flushed, breath tight. I didn't mean, but Snoop wasn't buying it. Nah. You meant exactly what you said. Diane, her voice tight with tension. Mr. Dogg is fully entitled to his seat, Mrs. Stokes. Elizabeth, voice brittle. This is unbelievable. Diane's jaw tightened. Ma'am, if you cannot comply, I'll have to call the captain. Elizabeth's eyes flared, but behind them, panic. Fine, she hissed through gritted teeth. But believe me, this isn't over. She turned on her heel, storming back to her assigned seat, her friend trailing behind with a whispered, You've made a scene, Elizabeth. As the tension settled, Diane faced Snoop, her voice quieter. Mr. Dogg. I apologize for the disruption. Snoop's reply was smooth, but there was an edge. Not your fault. But we both know this ain't the first time something like this has happened. Diane's lips pressed into a thin line. You're right. A pause. Then Snoop, with a flicker of something knowing. And it probably won't be the last. But beneath those calm words, there was a promise. Because if Elizabeth thought this was over, she had another thing coming. The cabin's tension had thinned, but only on the surface. The real storm was still brewing. Snoop sat back, his notebook resting on his lap, but his eyes stayed sharp behind his shades. He wasn't the type to cause a scene, but he also wasn't the type to let one slide. The soft chime of an intercom, then a smooth, practiced voice. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're experiencing a brief delay. Thank you for your patience. The delay, it wasn't random. Snoop's phone buzzed. A name on the screen, Marcus, Corporate Affairs. One of the few people he trusted in high places. He answered low. Yo, Marcus, need you to keep an eye on this flight. Something feels off. A short pause, then Marcus's voice. Calm, but sharp. Already on it. Snoop ended the call. His part was played. Now, it was a waiting game. Meanwhile, in the front galley, Diane and Gary, the flight attendant, huddled in urgent whispers. Gary, defensive. Look, I was just trying to resolve the issue. Diane, her voice clipped. You sided with her, Gary. You didn't ask. You assumed. Gary scoffed, but his voice wavered. Come on. She's platinum elite. The airline values people like her. Diane's eyes flashed. And what about him? She glanced towards Snoop. You didn't even hesitate before questioning his right to be here. Gary's face flushed. I didn't mean anything by it. Diane's voice dropped, cold and sharp. You did. And you're about to find out what that means. Back in first class, Elizabeth, still fuming, shot daggers at Snoop from her seat. Her nails tapped against the armrest. A steady, agitated rhythm. Her friend Lauren whispered urgently, Elizabeth, let it go. You're making this worse. But Elizabeth's pride was a furnace now, burning too hot to stop. She pressed the call button. A soft chime. Gary appeared, his smile strained. Yes, Mrs. Stokes? Elizabeth's voice dripped venom. I want the captain. Now. Gary stiffened. Mrs. Stokes, the captain is preparing for takeoff. Is there something? Her voice sliced through his excuse. Yes, there is. Either he fixes this, or I will. A shift. A murmur. The passengers felt it, and then, like thunder before the strike, the captain arrived, a tall, seasoned figure, calm but commanding. His eyes swept the room, landing on Elizabeth's flushed face. His voice was deep, steady, but sharp as glass. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Reynolds. I've been informed there's an issue." Elizabeth rose, her voice dripping entitlement. "Yes, there is. This man," she said, throwing a glare towards Snoop, "has taken my seat, and I'm being treated unfairly." The captain's gaze shifted to Snoop, steady, respectful, and with a trace of recognition. "Mr. Dogg," he said, his voice even, "do you have anything to add?" Snoop, calm as ever. "Paid for my seat, ain't moving a beat." Then the captain, final and firm. "Mrs. Stokes, Mr. Dogg is in the correct seat. There is no error." Elizabeth's composure cracked. You can't be serious. I'm a Platinum Elite member." The captain's eyes sharpened. "And I am the captain of this aircraft. You have two choices, Mrs. Stokes. Take your assigned seat or disembark." The air, electric. Elizabeth's face twisted, her voice a low hiss. "You'll regret this." The captain's voice, cold and clear. "No, ma'am, you will." The room still. But the story, far from over. The air in the cabin was heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. Elizabeth stood, frozen, her pride cracking under the weight of the captain's ultimatum. Around her the cabin was silent. No more whispers, just the watching. Then, her voice, sharp and cold, "You're making a mistake." The captain unshaken. "The only mistake would be letting this continue." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. But then, she smiled. Tight, dangerous. "Oh, you'll be hearing from my lawyers," she hissed. The captain's reply, flat, final. "Then you'll be speaking from the terminal. Security is standing by." The shift was instant. A flicker of panic in Elizabeth's eyes, because this wasn't playing out the way she expected. She looked around, searching for allies, for someone to back her up, but the other passengers' faces turned away. Lauren, her friend, head down, eyes glued to her lap, and Snoop. Snoop hadn't moved. He just sat. Calm, steady, not smug, not gloating, just unshaken. And somehow, that was worse. The captain, with that same cold authority. "Mrs. Stokes, last chance." A beat. Then, with a sharp breath, Elizabeth snapped. "Fine." She dropped into her assigned seat with a huff, her arms crossing tight over her chest. "But don't think this is over." But everyone knew it was. The captain turned to Snoop, his voice warmer. "Mr. Dogg, thank you for your patience." Snoop nodded once. "Appreciate you, Cap." The captain gave a small, knowing smile, then turned and walked back to the cockpit. But Snoop wasn't done. He picked up his phone. Calm, casual, a name on the screen. Marcus, Corporate Affairs. The line clicked. "Snoop?" Marcus greeted, his tone clipped but ready. "You good?" Snoop's voice was smooth, but sharp underneath. "I'm good, but they..." His gaze flicked briefly toward the front of the plane. "About to be real bad." A pause. Then Marcus, with a smile you could hear, "Say less. I'll handle it." In the front galley, Diane and Gary stood frozen as the captain passed them without a word, his silence louder than any reprimand. Gary, his voice low and tight. "Diane, you think this is gonna blow back on us?" Diane's answer came cold and sharp. "Oh, it already has." Her phone buzzed, an internal message from corporate. "Urgent immediate review, Flight 827, incident. Stand by." Gary saw her screen. His face went pale. "Wait," he stammered, panic breaking through his voice. "Corporate's already involved?" Diane's voice dropped. Every word weighted. "You don't get it, do you?" He didn't shout. He didn't argue. A pause. He just made a call. And then, cold realization settling over them both. He wasn't playing. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, fuming in her seat, leaned toward Lauren, her voice a venomous hiss. "He thinks he won." Lauren's voice was thin, barely a whisper. "Elizabeth, Please, let it go. But Elizabeth's eyes burned. No, I never lose. The engines roared. The plane began its taxi. But the real turbulence hadn't even started. The plane hummed steadily down the runway, but the real turbulence was about to hit. As the wheels left the ground, Diane's phone vibrated again. Another message from corporate. Effective immediately. Full investigation into Flight 827 incident. Stand by for directives. Her throat went dry. She turned to Gary, whose face was already pale. Gary's voice cracked. You think they'll fire us? Diane's reply was cold, clipped. They'll do worse. They'll erase us. In first class, Elizabeth stewed, eyes burning, nails tapping against her tray. She wasn't used to losing, especially not like this. Her voice a sharp whisper to Lauren. They'll regret this. I swear they will. But Lauren's voice, small, worn out. Elizabeth. You already lost. Elizabeth's glare snapped to her friend. What's that supposed to mean? Lauren's eyes tired but clear. You picked a fight. With the wrong one. Meanwhile, 3,500 feet above, the fallout was landing below. At the airline's headquarters, Marcus, calm, composed but razor-sharp, stood before the CEO with a simple statement. We have a problem, and his name is Snoop Dogg. The response was immediate. Corporate didn't review. They reacted. Within minutes, the orders came down, swift, decisive, unforgiving. Back on the plane. A chime. Then the captain's voice, this time different, cooler, sharper. Ladies and gentlemen, we have received directives from corporate headquarters regarding the earlier incident. Effective immediately, changes are being implemented. The cabin shifted. Passengers glanced at each other, confusion sparking. But in the galley, Diane's phone buzzed one last time. She glanced down, and her heart stopped. Final directive. Diane Lewis, flight supervisor, terminated. Barry Monroe, flight attendant, terminated. Elizabeth Stokes, platinum elite status, revoked. Immediate removal upon landing. Her breath hitched. She looked at Gary, his eyes locked on his own phone, his face ashen. Gary, his voice hollow, they fired us. Mid-flight, but the final blow came for Elizabeth. Her phone buzzed, an email from corporate. She skimmed it, her face darkening with every word. Dear Mrs. Stokes, due to your conduct on Flight 827, your Platinum Elite status has been permanently revoked. You are no longer eligible for our loyalty program. Additionally, you have been placed on our no-fly list, pending further review. The color drained from her face. Her voice cracked. They can't do this. But Lauren's voice, soft, cutting. They just did. And Snoop hadn't said a word. The plane touched down with a soft jolt. The familiar chime rang overhead, but the real landing was about to hit. Security entered the cabin, moving with precision. Diane and Gary escorted off first, their faces a mix of shock and regret. Then Elizabeth's, her voice shrill and wild. This is insanity. I'm a platinum. The security guard's voice, flat and cold. Not anymore. Her eyes darted, searching for allies. But the passengers stayed silent. And Snoop? He didn't even look her way. As the chaos unraveled behind him, Snoop stood, grabbing his leather notebook and sliding it under his arm. At the door he paused, turning to the flight crew now replacing Diane and Gary. His voice smooth, but loaded. Make sure corporate learns from this. The new attendant nodded, eyes wide, words clipped. Yes, sir, they already are. Outside the gate, the press was already there, flashes popping, questions flying. But Snoop, he didn't stop, didn't explain, because he knew this story would tell itself. Days later, the headlines exploded. Snoop Dogg sparks airline overhaul after first-class confrontation. Airline announces mandatory diversity training after viral incident. Platinum member loses status in shocking policy shakeup. But Snoop, he didn't post, didn't gloat, didn't clap back, because when you move with power, you don't talk about it, you just show up, and let the world react. Because sometimes the loudest statement is made without saying a word. And that is how tables turn. From entitlement to accountability, one seat became a statement. But what do you think? Was justice served, or did it go too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story had you hooked, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful narratives that make you feel something. And hey, don't forget to turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss what's coming next.